And when you think about the products that we use day to day, whether they're beauty products or, might be a frying pan or a spatula, plastic spatula or anything, how many of these sort of day-to-day consumer products have toxic chemicals in them, or at least one toxic chemical?
Almost everything. And it might shock you to think that is almost everything, but unfortunately it is. It's because our world now is overcome with plastics, single-use plastics, plastic containers, food containers. Almost everything that we know of has some plastic element to it. And that's really at the root of a lot of the problems that we have, because the chemicals that are used to create the plastics are leaching. The plastics themselves are breaking up, leading to microplastic and nanoplastic release that we are just being constantly bombarded with on a daily basis.
And what about beauty products? Because I had this conversation with my partner recently. So we're in the process now. I'm 32 years old. So it's that kind of season of life where you start thinking about having a family and kids and such. And so we've both become pretty conscious of the products that we're applying every day, from shampoos to deodorants.
For the most part, if you grab a product off of a store shelf, 9 times out of 10, there are chemicals of concern in them. And we're talking about major retailers, big box stores. If you go to smaller, let's say, health food stores and chains like that, then the percentage is much lower. So you have a better chance of getting a safer product at a health food store.
And before we get into it, can you give me an overview of your personal education and the career journey you've traveled that have resulted in the wisdom that you have now?
Yes, so I am a PhD toxicologist. I started studying reproductive toxicity in the laboratory as an undergrad, and we were looking at the effect of environmental chemicals that are pretty much everywhere in the environment. They're the products of combustion, so the combustion of gasoline in cars, in cigarettes, in cooking. So some of these chemicals, and we looked at the impact of them on the reproductive system in males and females. And what we saw was pretty striking, such that when the animals are challenged with these chemicals and they're pregnant, then the offspring, not only the daughters and the sons, but also the grandchildren are impacted by the grandmother being exposed.
How does that work?
So when a woman is pregnant with a female daughter, her developing ovaries, which will then someday contain the eggs that will then become the grandchildren, are also in the same environment as the mother. So what the mother is being exposed to, the baby is also being exposed to, and also her grandchildren are being exposed.
So if a mother is exposed to toxins, her baby's babies are being exposed to those toxins.
That's exactly right.
So there's sort of a generational toxification of people.
Yeah, that's called multi-generational toxicity. And it even goes a step further, transgenerational. That's when great-grandchildren can be impacted, because what's happening in utero is epigenetic changes, so changes to our DNA that are then being passed down through our progeny. So great-grandchildren, even if they live a perfectly clean lifestyle and haven't been exposed to toxins, could have already been genetically predisposed to developing some of these conditions.
Are there particular toxins that you think are especially susceptible to this sort of transgenerational passing down through mutations in our DNA?
Yeah, it's the endocrine disruptors. Things like phthalates, bisphenol, PFAS chemicals, a lot of the endocrine disruptors that some people are familiar with, other people are not, but that are found in our everyday products, like nonstick cookware, the makeup and cosmetics that we're using, the plastic containers that we're buying food in.
What is an endocrine disruptor? Explain that to me like I'm 9 years old.
Okay, so in the human body, we have 8 endocrine glands. So they're little centers in our bodies, and they secrete hormones. And these hormones regulate pretty much everything that you can think of. So from sleep, wake, digestion, to how well your brain works, cognition, to metabolism, so how quickly you can burn calories, how much fat you deposit, how much fat you can lose, and also your fertility, if you're able to have children someday. So endocrine disruptors are coming in, and they're basically disrupting. Like, just as the name indicates, they're throwing the balance off. They're messing up with the signaling. They're causing everything to go haywire in our bodies. So we really need to be careful, especially for children whose bodies are rapidly developing. And then you're throwing in these endocrine disrupting chemicals. It's like adding gasoline to, like a dumpster fire, basically.
And as it relates to children, are they especially susceptible to endocrine disruptors because they're in a developmental stage?
Absolutely. So with children, it's extremely unfortunate that they are the most susceptible and most vulnerable to a lot of toxins because, like you said, they're growing. They're not able to detoxify. In fact, a child's detoxification capacity doesn't fully develop until the age of 10 years. So,
detoxification capacity, what's that?
Yes, so the ability of your body to detoxify chemicals. We all have it. Everyone has it. The liver and the kidney are the detox organs, the main ones. But we have this capability of being able to break these chemicals down and remove them so that they don't cause harm in our bodies. But with children, that ability isn't fully developed until the age of 10 years old. So if you think about all these little children, they're being exposed even before they're born, after they're born, and then they can't even get rid of these chemicals from their body until they're 10 years old.
And what are some of the illnesses or diseases that we see in children that have been heavily exposed to these endocrine disruptors in our everyday environment?
The worst is cancer. So we see an increased risk of childhood leukemia with certain exposures. There's also neurodevelopmental delays, so cognitive deficits in children that are exposed to these chemicals. We also see increased rates of obesity. Obesity in children is skyrocketing now. Unprecedented levels that we have not seen before. And it's likely due to these chemicals and this genetic predisposition and programming that kids are just being dealt the worst hand possible.
What about things like neurodivergence? Is there links between things like ADHD and these endocrine disruptors? And, ADHD, autism, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, there is a link, actually. So some of these chemicals have been known to worsen these behavioral conditions, like ADHD and autism, like you mentioned.
And have they done studies on this?
Yes. So there's associations where they'll measure the amount of these chemicals in children through their urine or through their blood, and they'll confirm the severity of these conditions and be able to correlate it with the amount of the chemicals in their bodies.
And what about the impact this has on things like puberty? Because I was reading some stats before that. I think is it girls are going through puberty earlier and earlier, or is it later and later? I can't remember. It's one of the two.
It's earlier and earlier. So children who are being exposed to these chemicals are experiencing earlier puberty, earlier breast development, earlier menstrual cycles. And what that does is actually shift the entire window. Because if you think about it, we're born with a set number of eggs in our ovaries. Once those eggs are gone, that's when you start having menopause. So what's happening when you start your period earlier, you actually go through menopause earlier. And that can come with a whole host of risk factors, bone fractures, and so on and so forth.
And this is because of those endocrine disruptors?
Likely, yes.
How would they know?
They've done studies on this as well. So you can see that they've done observational studies where they'll ask families, when did your child start using beauty and personal care products, which are loaded with these chemicals? The children who used more products have more phthalates, more endocrine disruptors in their blood and in their urine, and then they have earlier puberty, unfortunately.
And as it relates to fertility, generally, in adults, are you aware of the shifts we've seen in infertility? Like, what are the numbers? How do you quantify the changes?
Well, over the last 100 years or so, there has been a drastic decline in the number of live births. So that's one of the numbers that I have looked at recently, right? So it isn't necessarily that more people are experiencing infertility. It could be a measure of people are having children later, could be. People are just having less children. But it is an overall measure of population level. So it looks like there's just less children being born. And that could be for a whole number of reasons, right? Are people not able to have kids? Are they choosing not to have kids? I would almost argue that it's the fact that people are not able to have kids. When you correlate that with the fact that sperm counts have declined by 50% worldwide, that is absolutely astonishing. We're not at the point yet where humans will go extinct. But if we continue on this path and don't make changes, which there are many ways that we can make changes, then we might be looking at population decline.
Isn't it the job of the FDA or some kind of government body to regulate the chemicals that are in our everyday items?
You would think, right? In Europe, the European Commission has a much better system of regulating chemicals. So they require upfront chemical testing depending on the amount that is produced. So chemical manufacturers need to provide data. So they have to fund these studies, these laboratory studies. They have to fund them and provide this package of information to the European Chemicals Agency, or ECHA. And once they do that, then based on the amount that they're producing, you have to give more information. You have to have more testing, such that if you're producing several metric tons of a chemical, you've got to do a whole bunch of studies to really prove that it is safe, not only for people, but also animals and the environment, that it's not going to be something that is persistent, that builds up, that can't be broken down, that starts to accumulate, because that's what we're seeing now with some of these chemicals. And that's really the problem, is that they don't break down, they don't go away, they don't disappear. So then what happens? It basically disrupts the entire ecosystem of the planet. And we're not disconnected from that, right? We're connected to the ecosystem. We rely on that. So if we're looking at it from the standpoint that testing of chemicals up front, that is absolutely something that we should be doing. But no one is really mandating that except in Europe.
Why don't they mandate it in other parts of the world like the United States?
Our system wasn't set up like that over here. I think we've got a different relationship between the government and with industry. I think there is a lack of regulations, a lack of requirements for toxicity testing, combined with the lack of corporate responsibility. So a lot of these manufacturers don't want to have to foot the bill and pay millions of dollars to have testing only to show that this chemical that they are so excited in love with can't be used because it's toxic.
Do you think it is malicious and intentional in terms of, do you think there's a concerted effort to make sure that the government doesn't increase regulation on these industries so that they can continue to produce low-cost items that have long shelf lives and are cheaper?
I would hope not, but it's looking like that.